The dust motes danced in the beam of Detective Ray Maxwell's flashlight, illuminating the forgotten corners of the county archives. Boxes stacked precariously, each holding the ghosts of lives interrupted, stories left unfinished. Ray, a man weathered by years on the force and haunted by the faces of the unsolved, was on a self-imposed mission. He was digging into the cold case files of Colorado, specifically the disappearances that had faded from memory, the victims swallowed by the vastness of the Rocky Mountains and the indifference of time. His focus narrowed on the case of the Peterson family, Sarah, Mark, and their two young children, Lily and Tom. They vanished without a trace from their remote cabin in the San Juan Mountains in the summer of 1998. No ransom note, no witnesses, no sign of struggle. Just an empty cabin and a silence that screamed louder than any cry for help. The initial investigation had been thorough, but the harsh terrain and lack of leads had eventually led to the file being shelved. Another tragic mystery lost to the Colorado wilderness. Ray felt a kinship with these forgotten victims. He carried the weight of every unsolved case like stones in his pockets, each one a testament to a failure he couldn't accept. The Peterson file, with its echoes of a family ripped apart, resonated deeply. He imagined the terror in Sarah's eyes, the confusion in Mark's, the innocent fear of the children. He meticulously reviewed the old reports, the faded photographs of the idyllic cabin, the desperate pleas from Sarah's frantic sister. The original investigators had leaned towards a hiking accident gone wrong, or perhaps a bear attack. But Ray felt a nagging inconsistency. Mark was an experienced outdoorsman. They wouldn't have wandered off unprepared, especially with young children. Days turned into nights as Ray immersed himself in the Petersons' last known days. He tracked down old neighbors, their memories hazy but their unease palpable. One elderly woman, Mrs. Gable, recalled seeing a strange truck near the Petersons' cabin the day before they vanished. "Big, dark thing," she'd said, her voice thin with age. "Didn't look like it belonged up there." The detail had been noted in the original report but dismissed as insignificant. Ray felt a jolt. A big, dark truck. It didn't fit the narrative of a simple accident. He started digging into local logging companies active in the area at the time. The names were mostly dead ends, but one kept resurfacing. The Blackwood Timber Company, notorious for its aggressive expansion and disregard for environmental regulations. He found an old environmental protest flyer, dated a week before the Petersons' disappearance. The flyer featured a photograph of Mark Peterson, his face filled with righteous anger, leading a small group of locals in a protest against Blackwood's logging practices near a protected watershed. A cold knot formed in Ray's stomach. The Petersons weren't just a family on a quiet vacation. They were activists standing in the way of a powerful corporation. The power dynamic shifted dramatically in Ray's mind. This wasn't a random tragedy. It felt targeted. He tracked down old Blackwood employees, men who had long since left the company, their consciences perhaps stirring with the passage of time. One, a grizzled foreman named Dale, initially refused to talk, his eyes darting nervously. But when Ray showed him the picture of the Peterson family, a flicker of recognition and something akin to guilt crossed his face. Dale confessed to seeing Blackwood executives meeting with a couple of shady characters around the time of the disappearance. He hadn't known what they were discussing, but the air had been thick with menace. He also recalled hearing rumors, whispers among the workers, about the Petersons being taken care of. The pieces clicked into place with chilling clarity. Blackwood hadn't just ignored the Petersons' protests. They had silenced them. The power they wielded, the disregard for anything that stood in their way, had led to the unthinkable. Ray felt a surge of anger, hot and righteous. The Petersons hadn't simply vanished. They had been victims of corporate greed and violence, their lives deemed expendable in the pursuit of profit. The dramatic irony was gut-wrenching. The very beauty of the mountains they loved had become their final resting place. Armed with Dale's testimony and the unearthed evidence of Blackwood's potential involvement, Ray reopened the Peterson case. The initial skepticism from his colleagues was met with the undeniable weight of the new findings. The cold case files, once gathering dust, were now buzzing with renewed activity. The investigation led them to a remote logging site, long abandoned, but still bearing the scars of Blackwood's operation. Using ground-penetrating radar, they discovered disturbed Earth, a site that hadn't been properly logged. And there, buried deep beneath the unforgiving soil of the Colorado mountains, they found them, the remains of the Peterson family. The news sent shockwaves through Colorado. The forgotten victims finally had a voice. Justice, long delayed, was finally within reach. The Blackwood executives, long shielded by their wealth and power, were brought to account for their heinous crime. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable as the details of their betrayal were laid bare. The verdict came swiftly, guilty. A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom, a sense that the scales of justice, however belatedly, had finally balanced. The powerful had been held accountable. The lives of the forgotten had been honored. Ray watched the proceedings, a quiet satisfaction settling within him. The stones in his pockets felt a little lighter. The faces of the unsolved wouldn't fade entirely. He had given the Peterson family back their story. But as the trial concluded, a new piece of evidence surfaced. A single, anonymous email sent to the lead investigator. It contained a photograph, a grainy image taken years ago, showing not just the Blackwood executives meeting with the shady characters, but also a third person, someone Ray recognized instantly. Someone connected to law enforcement, someone who had been part of the original Peterson investigation. The email contained a single line of text. They weren't the only ones involved. Look closer to home. Ray felt a chill crawl down his spine. The betrayal went deeper than corporate greed. It had infiltrated the very system meant to protect them. The fight for justice for the forgotten victims of Colorado was far from over. The darkness, it seemed, had roots in places no one had suspected. The anonymous email, a digital whisper in the sterile environment of the precinct, sent a ripple of unease through Detective Ray Maxwell. They weren't the only ones involved. Look closer to home. The words, stark and accusatory, hung in the air, shattering the fragile sense of closure that had settled after the Blackwood verdict. A knot of suspicion tightened in Ray's gut. The betrayal, it seemed, had roots that stretched far beyond the corporate boardroom, reaching into the very heart of the system meant to uphold justice. The photograph attached to the email was grainy, the faces partially obscured by shadow, but Ray recognized the two Blackwood executives and the hulking figures they were meeting with. And then there was the third person, standing slightly apart, his features more distinct. Sheriff Tom Hastings, the lead investigator on the Peterson case back in '98. The man who had initially dismissed the possibility of foul play. The man Ray had trusted implicitly by relying on his original reports. A wave of nausea washed over Ray. Could it be true? Had the very person tasked with finding the Peterson family been complicit in their disappearance? The dramatic irony was a cruel twist of the knife. The guardians of justice, potentially the perpetrators of its most grievous failures. Ray felt a renewed urgency, a burning need to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. He couldn't shake the image of the Peterson family, their hopes and dreams extinguished, their fate sealed by greed and a betrayal that cut deeper than he had initially imagined. He started by revisiting the original investigation files, this time with a cynical eye, searching for inconsistencies he might have missed, subtle manipulations of evidence. Hastings' reports were meticulous, almost too perfect, painting a clear picture of a family lost in the wilderness. But now, Ray saw the gaps, the questions left unasked, the leads that were never pursued. He tracked down former deputies who had worked under Hastings in the late '90s. Many were retired, their memories faded, but a few recalled Hastings' insistence on the accident theory, his reluctance to explore other avenues. One old-timer, a gruff man named Earl, remembered Hastings being unusually dismissive of the Blackwood angle. "He shut that down quick," Earl had said, his voice laced with a lingering unease. "Said we didn't have the resources to go after big money." Ray also looked into Hastings' financial records from that period. There were no blatant signs of corruption, no sudden influx of cash, but there were subtle anomalies, unexplained payments. a pattern of living beyond his reported means. It was circumstantial, but it added another layer of suspicion. The deeper Ray dug, the more convinced he became that Hastings was involved. But what was his motive? Was he simply bought off by Blackwood? Or was there something more sinister at play? He focused on the shady characters in the photograph. Dale, the former Blackwood foreman, had described them as muscle. Ray started looking into local organized crime, the kind that might be hired to make problems disappear. A name surfaced repeatedly: the Costello brothers. Known for their ruthlessness and their willingness to do the dirty work for the right price. Ray unearthed old police files linking the Costello brothers to Blackwood. They had been hired as security during some of Blackwood's more contentious logging operations, known for their intimidation tactics against environmental activists. The timeline matched the Petersons' disappearance. The picture was becoming clearer: a dark tapestry of corporate greed, organized crime, and a corrupt lawman pulling the strings. Hastings hadn't just ignored the Blackwood angle. He had actively steered the investigation away from it, protecting those responsible. The power shift in Ray's understanding of the case was immense. He had initially seen Blackwood as the primary antagonist. Now, the betrayal felt more insidious, reaching into the very institutions designed to protect the innocent. Ray knew he couldn't confront Hastings directly without concrete proof. He needed more. He needed to understand the full extent of Hastings' involvement and the Costello brothers' role in the Petersons' fate. His investigation led him back to the San Juan Mountains, to the abandoned logging site where the Petersons' remains had been found. He meticulously searched the surrounding area, his eyes scanning the rugged terrain. He was looking for anything the original investigation might have missed, any lingering trace of what had happened that fateful summer. Deep within the woods, concealed by thick undergrowth, he found it. A hidden clearing, overgrown and forgotten. In the center of the clearing, partially buried beneath layers of decaying leaves, was a small, metallic object, a voice recorder. His heart pounded in his chest as he carefully retrieved it. The recorder was old, damaged, but with painstaking effort, he managed to recover the audio files. The recordings were fragmented, distorted, but the voices were unmistakable. Sarah and Mark Peterson, and two other voices, cold and menacing, the Costello brothers. The recordings painted a horrifying picture. The Petersons hadn't been victims of an accident. They had been ambushed, confronted about their activism. There was talk of a message being sent. Then the sounds of struggle, of terror, and finally silence. And then a fifth voice, Sheriff Tom Hastings. His voice, calm and authoritative, directing the Costello brothers, ensuring the job was done, ordering them to dispose of the bodies in a way that would look like an accident. The dramatic irony was devastating. The man who had sworn to protect them had orchestrated their deaths. The man who had led the search party had known all along where they were. Ray felt a surge of grief and fury. The betrayal was even deeper, even more personal than he had imagined. Hastings hadn't just been corrupt. He had been a monster in a uniform. He had enough. The recordings were damning. He contacted his captain, his voice tight with barely contained rage, laying out his findings. The captain, initially skeptical, was quickly convinced by the weight of the evidence. The arrest of Sheriff Tom Hastings sent shockwaves through Colorado, eclipsing even the Blackwood verdict. The man who had embodied law and order in the small mountain communities was revealed to be a cold-blooded killer. His betrayal a festering wound on the trust of the people he had sworn to serve. Justice, it seemed, was finally closing in on all those responsible for the Petersons' deaths. The powerful had been held accountable, and now the corrupt guardians were facing their reckoning. But as Hastings was interrogated, he remained chillingly calm, offering no remorse, no explanation. And then he dropped a bombshell. He hadn't been working alone. He had been taking orders. From whom? Ray pressed. Hastings simply smiled, a chilling, knowing smile. "You'll find out," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This goes higher than you can imagine." As Hastings was led away, a new name surfaced, whispered among the investigators. A name that sent a fresh wave of dread through Ray. a name connected to powerful figures in the state government, figures who had a vested interest in silencing dissent, in controlling the narrative. The fight for justice for the forgotten victims of Colorado was far from over. The tendrils of betrayal reached into even higher places, suggesting a conspiracy that was far more extensive and dangerous than Ray had ever anticipated. The darkness, it seemed, had many layers, and the truth was a treacherous climb to the summit. The silence of the mountains might have finally yielded its secrets, but the whispers of corruption were just beginning. The name, whispered like a curse through the sterile halls of the precinct, sent a chill deeper than the Colorado mountain air down Ray Maxwell's spine. Senator Alan Caldwell, a man who embodied power in the state, a figure whose influence stretched across legislative halls and into the shadowy corners of industry. Hastings, the seemingly corrupt sheriff, had been taking orders from a senator. The implications were staggering. The betrayal wasn't just a localized rot. It was systemic, reaching the highest echelons of power. The weight of the revelation settled heavily on Ray. He had thought he was fighting for the memory of a forgotten family, against the greed of a corporation and the corruption of a local lawman. Now, the scope of the conspiracy broadened, revealing a network of influence that threatened to swallow the very foundations of justice in Colorado. Ray, along with a newly formed task force dedicated to unraveling the truth behind the Peterson case and Hastings' confession, began to meticulously dissect Senator Caldwell's life and career. They scrutinized his legislative record, his campaign finances, his connections to the Blackwood Timber Company, and any other entities that might have benefited from silencing environmental activists. Caldwell was a master of political maneuvering, his public image carefully crafted as a champion of the people. But beneath the polished veneer, they found a pattern of quiet support for corporate interests, a consistent downplaying of environmental concerns, and a chilling ruthlessness towards anyone who threatened his agenda. The connection to Blackwood was undeniable. Caldwell had received significant campaign donations from the company, and his legislative votes consistently favored their interests. But the direct link to the Peterson murders remained elusive. Caldwell was too careful to leave a direct trail. The task force focused on individuals within Caldwell's inner circle, those who might have acted as intermediaries. A name that surfaced repeatedly was Marcus Thorne, Caldwell's longtime chief of staff, a man known for his unwavering loyalty and his ability to make problems disappear. Thorne had a reputation for being Caldwell's fixer, the one who handled the senator's dirty work. Ray felt a grim sense of déjà vu. Thorne was the kind of operator who could orchestrate something like the Peterson murders, shielding Caldwell from direct involvement. The power shift had occurred again, the focus moving from the local level to the state capitol, revealing a more sophisticated and dangerous enemy. They brought Thorne in for questioning. He was smooth, evasive, denying any knowledge of the Peterson case or any wrongdoing by the senator. But Ray saw a flicker of unease in his eyes, a carefully concealed nervousness. Thorne knew something. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sarah Peterson's sister, Emily, who had never given up hope, had continued her own quiet investigation over the years. She had kept meticulous records of her communications with law enforcement, her own findings, and her suspicions. She presented Ray with a series of old phone records, showing a brief but intense period of communication between Sheriff Hastings and Marcus Thorne in the days leading up to and immediately following the Peterson family's disappearance. The timing was damning. Hastings, the local sheriff, was in close contact with a powerful senator's chief of staff right when the Petersons vanished. It was more than a coincidence. Armed with the phone records, Ray confronted Thorne again. This time, the carefully constructed facade began to crack. Thorne, realizing the walls were closing in, offered a carefully worded confession, admitting to acting as a liaison between Caldwell and Hastings, relaying concerns about the Petersons' activism. But he stopped short of admitting direct involvement in the murders. Thorne painted a picture of Caldwell as a man who valued order and efficiency, someone who saw the Petersons as an obstacle to progress. He hinted at Caldwell's displeasure, his desire for the problem to be resolved. But Thorne maintained that he never explicitly ordered their deaths. Ray didn't believe him, The language Thorne used, the carefully chosen words, felt like a shield, protecting someone higher up. He knew Caldwell was the ultimate target. The task force intensified its investigation into Caldwell, scrutinizing his finances, his communications, looking for any link, however tenuous, to the Costello brothers or any evidence that directly implicated him in ordering the murders. They interviewed former Caldwell aides, campaign staffers, anyone who might have witnessed the senator's darker side. Slowly, a picture emerged of a man who ruled through intimidation and fear, someone who wasn't afraid to use his power to silence opposition. One former aide, terrified but finally willing to talk, recounted a private conversation he had overheard between Caldwell and Thorne shortly after the Peterson case went cold. Caldwell had been furious about the negative publicity surrounding the disappearances, lamenting the mess that had been made. He hadn't explicitly admitted involvement, but his words, laced with anger and frustration, strongly suggested he was aware of what had happened. The evidence was mounting, circumstantial but compelling. The phone records, Thorne's carefully crafted confession, the testimony of Caldwell's former aide, it painted a damning portrait of a senator who had orchestrated the silencing of environmental activists. Ray felt a grim satisfaction. The truth, buried for so long, was finally seeing the light. Justice for the Peterson family, it seemed, was within reach once more. The powerful were being held accountable, the corruption exposed. But as they prepared to arrest Senator Caldwell, a new development sent a jolt of alarm through the task force. Marcus Thorne, who had been cooperating, albeit cautiously, suddenly vanished. He had skipped bail, leaving behind no trace. And then came the anonymous email, this time sent directly to Ray. The message was short, chilling, and written in cryptic code. Once deciphered, it read, "The shepherd protects his flock. You are disturbing the balance. Tread carefully, detective." The message was a clear threat, a stark reminder of the forces they were up against. Caldwell wasn't acting alone. He was part of a larger network, a cabal of powerful individuals who operated in the shadows, protecting their own. The cryptic warning, "The shepherd protects his flock. You are disturbing the balance. Tread carefully, detective," hung heavy in the air, a digital sword poised above Ray Maxwell's head. The disappearance of Marcus Thorne confirmed their worst fears. Senator Alan Caldwell was not a lone wolf. He was part of a powerful, shadowy network, a cabal of influence that stretched beyond the borders of Colorado, protecting its own with ruthless efficiency. The fight for the forgotten victims of the Peterson family had become a battle against a hydra, where severing one head only revealed another, more menacing one. Ray, along with the task force, found themselves walking a tightrope. The pressure to bring Caldwell to justice was immense, fueled by the public outcry over Hastings' arrest and the growing suspicion of deeper corruption. But the threat was palpable, a chilling undercurrent that permeated every step of their investigation. They knew they were being watched, their communications monitored, their every move scrutinized. The key to unraveling this network, they realized, lay in understanding the shepherd mentioned in the message. Who was pulling Caldwell's strings? Who had the power to make a seasoned political operative like Thorne vanish into thin air? Their investigation led them down a rabbit hole of interconnected corporations, shadowy lobbying groups, and anonymous shell companies. They discovered a pattern of influence peddling, where Caldwell consistently voted in favor of legislation that benefited a select group of ultra-wealthy individuals and powerful entities, often at the expense of the environment and the public good. A name surfaced repeatedly in these convoluted financial trails: Julian Thorne, Marcus Thorne's older brother. Julian was a titan of industry, a billionaire with his fingers in everything from energy to pharmaceuticals, a man who operated in the rarefied air of the global elite, far removed from the dusty trails of the San Juan Mountains, yet seemingly connected to the fate of the Peterson family. Julian Thorne was the shepherd. The realization was both terrifying and illuminating. Caldwell was merely a pawn in a much larger game, a cog in a machine controlled by individuals who wielded power on a scale Ray had only read about in conspiracy novels. The motive for silencing the Petersons became clearer. Their activism hadn't just threatened Blackwood Timber. It had threatened the interests of Julian Thorne's vast empire, which had significant stakes in the exploitation of Colorado's natural resources. The power shift was complete. Ray was no longer chasing local corruption or even state-level influence. He was going up against a force that transcended borders, a network woven into the fabric of the global economy. Bringing down Julian Thorne seemed an impossible task. He was insulated by layers of wealth and influence, protected by an army of lawyers and fixers. But Ray had a weapon Thorne didn't anticipate: the unwavering determination to honor the memory of the Peterson family and the growing public outrage that was building with each revelation. Ray and the task force meticulously built their case, connecting the financial dots, tracing the flow of money from Thorne's companies to shadowy entities that had, in turn, funded Blackwood's operations and, indirectly, Hastings' corruption. They found evidence of orchestrated smear campaigns against environmental activists and a pattern of silencing dissent through intimidation and, in the case of the Petersons, violence. The tension mounted as they prepared to move against Thorne. They knew they were poking a sleeping giant, and the retaliation could be swift and brutal. Ray received anonymous threats, his every move scrutinized. But he pressed on, fueled by the faces of Sarah, Mark, Lily, and Tom, their silent plea for justice echoing in his mind. The arrest of Julian Thorne sent shockwaves through the global financial markets. The titan of industry, once untouchable, was now facing charges of conspiracy to murder. The world watched, stunned, as the carefully constructed facade of power and respectability crumbled. The trial was a spectacle, a battle between Ray's relentless pursuit of truth and Thorne's vast resources and army of defense lawyers. The prosecution laid out the intricate web of financial connections, the evidence of orchestrated intimidation, and the chilling testimony of those who had witnessed Thorne's ruthlessness. Ray Maxwell took the stand, his voice steady as he recounted the long and arduous journey to uncover the truth, from the dusty archives to the opulent boardrooms of the ultra-rich. He spoke of the forgotten victims, their lives cut short by greed and a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power. The dramatic irony was not lost on the jury. The very system designed to protect the innocent had been corrupted by the very forces it was meant to regulate. The pursuit of profit had trumped the value of human life. The verdict came down not quickly, but decisively. Julian Thorne, the untouchable titan, was found guilty. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom, a sense that even the most powerful were not above the reach of justice, when that justice was pursued with unwavering dedication. Ray watched as Thorne was led away, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. The weight on Ray's shoulders finally lifted. The forgotten victims had been remembered. Their story had been told. Justice, after so long, had finally been served. The fallout was immense. The exposure of Thorne's network sent ripples through the global elite, leading to further investigations and a long-overdue reckoning for corporate malfeasance and political corruption. The case became a landmark, a testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of holding even the most powerful accountable. Years later, Ray stood overlooking the vast expanse of the San Juan Mountains, the wind whispering through the pines. He visited the memorial erected near the site where the Peterson family was found, a simple stone bearing their names. The scars of the betrayal remained, a stark reminder of the darkness that could lurk beneath the surface of power. But there was also a sense of hope, a belief that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the truth could prevail. But as he stood there, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the ground beneath his feet. High above, a small, unmarked aircraft, its transponder silent, banked sharply in the distance, heading deeper into the wilderness. And miles away, in a secure, undisclosed location, a team of individuals, their faces illuminated by the glow of computer screens, were meticulously reconstructing Thorne's network, their fingers flying across keyboards, preparing for the next phase of their operation. Julian Thorne might have fallen, but the Hydra had not been fully slain. The shepherd had been silenced, but the flock remained, and new shepherds would inevitably rise to guide them. The fight for justice, Ray knew, was a never-ending battle against the insidious nature of power, a battle that would continue to be fought in the shadows, long after the headlines faded. The silence of the mountains might have yielded one dark secret, but the vast wilderness still held others, waiting to be unearthed. And the network, the unseen hand that had orchestrated so much death and deceit, was far from being dismantled, merely lying dormant, gathering its strength for the next move in a dangerous game.